It was a stormy night when I first noticed it. Heavy rain pounded against the windows, and the wind howled like a wild animal. I was home alone in the house where I'd grown up, my parents away on a long vacation. Though I'd been there countless times, that night felt different, oppressive somehow, as if the house itself was breathing around me. The electricity had flickered twice earlier, leaving me in darkness long enough to fetch candles. Now, the dim light cast shadows that danced unnervingly on the walls. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Just nerves. After all, I hadn't spent much time alone in the old house since moving out. Still, the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth, staring at my reflection in the old mirror above the sink. The glass was slightly warped from distorting my features just enough to feel unfamiliar. My tired eyes met their mirror counterparts, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, just a flicker of movement that didn't match mine. I paused, leaning closer to the mirror. My reflection leaned in too, perfectly synchronized. I exhaled, relieved, and turned to rinse my toothbrush. That's when I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, my reflection hadn't moved. It was still leaning forward, staring directly at me. My heart froze, the sound of the rain outside fading into the background. Slowly, I turned back to the mirror, and my reflection straightened, moving as if nothing had happened. A nervous laugh escaped my lip. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. But the unease stayed with me long after I left the bathroom. The next day, the house seemed quieter than usual. I attributed it to the absence of my parents' usual bustling presence, but deep down, I knew something else was. Every time I passed a mirror, I felt its weight, an invisible pressure, as though something was watching me. It got worse that evening. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when a faint tapping sound caught my attention. It was soft at first, like the ticking of a distant clock, but it grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. I followed the noise to the hallway, where the old full-length mirror hung. My reflection stood there, perfectly still, mimicking my every move. I stepped closer, peering into the glass, and for a moment, I thought I saw something behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, my reflection was smiling. Over the next few days, my reflection's behavior grew more erratic. Sometimes it moved too quickly, its gestures sharp and unnatural. Other times it seemed to watch me, its eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. A hunger, perhaps. One night I decided I'd had enough. Grabbing an old blanket, I draped it over the hallway mirror, determined to block out whatever was happening. The relief was immediate. But then, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. With my heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and crept into the hallway. The blanket I'd placed over the mirror was on the floor, crumpled like a discarded piece of paper. My reflection wasn't there. The mirror was dark, like an endless void. I backed away, but as I did, a hand shot out of the blackness, slamming against the glass inside. I screamed, stumbling backward, and the hand disappeared. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it had been a dream. I avoided the mirrors as much as possible, but their presence felt inescapable. The large antique mirror in the living room, the small decorative one in the hallway, even the reflective surface of the microwave. It was everywhere. I decided to call my parents, hoping for some reassurance. As I dialed, I glanced at the mirror in the living room. My reflection wasn't looking at me. Instead, it was staring at something behind me. I dropped the phone, whipping around, but there was nothing there. My reflection grinned, its eyes cold and mocking. That night, the power went out completely. The house was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning. I lit a candle and sat in the corner of my bedroom, clutching a baseball bat. It was just after midnight when I heard the laughter. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A low, guttural chuckle that seemed to echo through the house. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. No answer. I slowly made my way to the hallway, the candle flickering in my hand. The laughter grew louder, and I realized it was coming from the bathroom mirror. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. When I opened the door, the mirror was fogged up, as though someone had been breathing on it. And then in the condensation, words began to appear. "Let me out." I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold rain drenching me to the bone. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked in the driveway, staring at the darkened windows of the house. When morning came, I packed my bags and left. But the mirrors didn't let me go. Even now, in my apartment miles away, I can feel them watching. My reflection moves when I don't, grins when I frown, and stares at me with a knowing intensity. I've covered every mirror I can find, but it doesn't matter. The tapping continues, growing louder each night, and sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I hear the laughter again. I know it's waiting for the perfect moment to step through. The snow was falling thick and fast that December night, blanketing the quiet neighborhood in a serene stillness. I had just returned from a long day at work, eager to curl up in my cozy living room with a cup of hot cocoa and forget about the world. The house, though old, had always felt like a safe haven, especially during the holidays. The warmth of the fireplace, the twinkling lights of the Christmas tree, and the faint scent of cinnamon candles filled the air. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first strange thing happened as I was unpacking the groceries. I reached into one of the bags for a box of cookies when I noticed something unexpected. Nestled between the items was a small red ribbon, tied neatly into a bow. It wasn't mine. Puzzled, I held it up, inspecting it closely. The ribbon looked old, its edges frayed, as though it had been handled many times. I brushed it off as a mistake, perhaps something that had fallen into my bag at the store. I tossed it into the trash and thought nothing more of it. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I saw the ribbon again. It was sitting on my nightstand, tied neatly into the same bow. My stomach dropped. I distinctly remembered throwing it away. My rational mind told me I had probably forgotten, or that I had picked it up again without thinking. But deep down, a chill crept over me. I threw it away again, this time stuffing it into the kitchen trash bin and making sure the lid was securely closed. The following day, I found it in the living room, draped over the back of the couch like it belonged there. I stared at it for a long time, trying to understand how it kept returning. This time, I didn't touch it. Instead, I left it where it was and went about my day, ignoring the unease gnawing at me. By evening, more ribbons began to appear, one on the bathroom sink, another tied around the dining room chair, and one, a larger one, woven into the branches of my Christmas. Each ribbon was identical, deep red and tied into the same perfect bow. I finally decided to call my best friend Sarah to vent about the situation. "You're probably just tired," she said, laughing it off. "It's the holidays. You're overworked and imagining things." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But then, as I sat on the couch, staring at the ribbon on the coffee table, I noticed something. It was moving. The bow slowly unraveled, the ends of the ribbon slithering like snakes. I froze, unable to look away as the fabric twisted and contorted into words. "Come find me!" I screamed, grabbing the ribbon and throwing it into the fireplace. The flames consumed it, the fabric curling and blackening until it was gone. That night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed magnified in the silence of the house. The creak of the floorboards, the wind rattling the windows, the faint ticking of the clock. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of soft rustling. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding as I strained to listen. The sound was coming from the hallway. Clutching my phone as a makeshift flashlight, I crept toward the noise. The faint rustling grew louder, leading me to the attic door. I hadn't been up there in years. The pull string dangled ominously, swaying slightly as if moved by an unseen hand. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the string. The ladder creaked down, and cold air rushed out, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and decay. The attic was darker than I remembered, the single bulb casting long shadows across the cluttered space. Boxes of old decorations and forgotten memories were piled haphazardly. But in the center of the room stood something new, a mirror. Its frame was ornate, carved from dark wood, and it looked out of place among the dusty relics. Red ribbons dangled from its edges, swaying gently despite the stillness of the air. As I stepped closer, I noticed my reflection didn't match my movement. My reflection was smiling. It tilted its head, studying me with cold, calculating eyes. Slowly, it raised a hand and pointed to something behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the mirror, the ribbons began appearing everywhere after that. They weren't just in the house anymore. They were on my car, in my office, even tied to the branches of trees outside. Each one seemed to mock me, daring me to unravel it. I couldn't take it anymore. Desperate, I returned to the attic, determined to smash the mirror and end whatever curse had taken hold of my life. But when I climbed the ladder, the mirror was in its place was a single ribbon, tied into a bow around a small, old-fashioned. I don't know why I took. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the faint hope that it would lead to answers. That night, as I held the key in my hand, I noticed something strange. It was warm, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. A whisper echoed in my ears, soft and distant. "Come find me." The words seemed to pull me toward the front door, where another ribbon waited, tied around the handle. I followed the ribbons through the snow-covered streets, each one leading me farther from the safety. They guided me to the edge of the forest, where the towering trees loomed like silent sentinels. The last ribbon was tied to a small wooden box, buried in the snow. My hands trembled as I unlocked it with the key. Inside was a photograph of a little girl, her face partially obscured by a red ribbon tied over her mouth. Written on the back were the words, "You freed me. Now it's your turn." I heard laughter, childlike yet chilling, and when I looked up, the ribbons were everywhere, wrapping around my arms and legs, pulling me toward the darkness of the forest. The last thing I saw before the world went black was a pair of glowing red eyes watching the trees. I'd always loved winter. There was something magical about waking up to a world blanketed in white, the trees heavy with snow and the air crisp and biting. That Christmas season, I was staying at my uncle's remote cabin in the woods, a quiet retreat to escape the stress of the city. It was peaceful, isolated, and eerily silent at night. Too silent. The first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time curled up by the fireplace, reading and sipping on hot chocolate. The cabin felt warm and cozy, its rustic charm a welcome change from my cramped apartment. Then, one morning, I noticed something strange. There was a snowman in the. It was tall, its rounded body slightly misshapen but still impressive. A red scarf was tied around its neck, and a pair of dark stones formed its eyes. A crooked grin was carved into its face, giving it an unsettling, almost lifelike expression. The thing was, I hadn't built it. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen a single person since arriving. I told myself it was probably left over from a previous visitor or maybe a local kid who wandered by. Still, the thought of someone on the property without me knowing made me uneasy. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The cabin's large windows looked out onto the snow-covered yard, and every time I glanced outside, the snowman seemed closer. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia. The shadows cast by the moonlight could play tricks on the mind, especially in such a desolate place. But the unease persisted. When I went to bed, I double-checked all the locks, pulling the curtains tight to block out the sight of the snowman. Yet, I still felt its presence, as if those dark stone eyes were staring through the walls. The next morning, the snowman was gone. I stared at the empty patch of snow where it had stood, my stomach twisting into knots. Tracks led away from the spot, deep, unmistakable footprints that disappeared into the. Someone had to be messing. That was the only explanation. Determined to prove to myself that it was just a prank, I grabbed my coat and followed the tracks. They wound through the trees, leading me deeper into the forest. The air grew colder, and the snow seemed untouched except for the footprints. After what felt like an hour, the tracks ended abruptly in a small clearing. There was nothing there. No person, no snowman, just an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. That night, I heard the crunching of snow outside the cabin. It was faint at first, like someone walking slowly, deliberately. I froze, listening intently as the sound circled the cabin. My heart raced as I realized it wasn't stopping. It was moving back and forth, pacing just outside the windows. Grabbing a flashlight, I mustered the courage to peek outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the snow-covered yard. The snowman was back. It stood right outside the living room window, its grin wider, its dark eyes boring into me. The scarf around its neck fluttered slightly in the wind, and I could have sworn I saw its body shift, as though it were breathing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fireplace, clutching the flashlight, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. The snowman stayed outside, unmoving, its presence a constant weight on my mind. By morning, it was gone again, leaving no trace behind. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. The isolation that had once felt comforting now felt suffocating, and the snowman, whatever it was, had turned my retreat into a nightmare. I packed my bags, but before I could leave, I heard it. A soft, childlike giggle echoing through the cabin. I spun around, scanning the room, but I was alone. The giggling grew louder, coming from the kitchen. My legs felt like lead as I crept toward the sound. There, on the kitchen table, was the red scarf. It was damp, as if it had been left in the snow and tied neatly into a bow. A voice whispered in my ear, cold and low, "Don't leave me." I screamed, stumbling back and grabbing my car keys. I didn't care about the storm raging outside. I had to get out of there. As I drove down the icy road, I glanced in the rear-view mirror and felt my blood run cold. The snowman was in the back seat. Its dark stone eyes met mine, its crooked grin stretching wider. The car swerved as panic overtook me, and I barely managed to regain control. When I looked again, it was gone, but I wasn't alone. The air inside the car grew colder, frost creeping along the windows. The whisper came again, louder this. "You can't escape." I never made it back to the city. The authorities found my car abandoned on the side of the road a week later, its windows frosted over from the inside. No footprints surrounded it, and no trace of me was ever found. But sometimes, on quiet winter nights, locals claim they see a tall snowman standing by the edge of the road. It wears a red scarf, its dark eyes watching, waiting for someone new to take its place. Christmas was my favorite time of the year. Every December, I'd turn my modest little house into a festive wonderland, stringing up lights, decorating the tree, and baking cookies that filled the air with the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg. That year, however, felt different. I'd recently moved into a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town, hoping for a fresh start. The neighbors were friendly enough, and the houses on my street were beautifully decorated for the holidays, except for one. At the far end of the cul-de-sac stood a large, dilapidated house. Its windows were boarded up, its paint peeling, and the yard overgrown with weeds. There were no decorations, no signs of life, just an eerie stillness that made it stand out against the cheerful glow of the other homes. One evening, as I was untangling a string of lights to hang on my porch, I noticed something strange. The old house at the end of the street was lit up. The glow was faint, barely visible through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, but it was there, a flickering, uneven light like candles or an old lamp. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if someone had finally moved in. But when I mentioned it to my neighbor the next day, she just shook her head. "No one's lived there in years," she said. "It's been abandoned since the fire." That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the light. Around midnight, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. I bundled up in my coat and scarf and stepped outside into the biting cold. The neighborhood was quiet, the snow crunching softly beneath my boots as I made my way toward the house. As I approached, I saw that the light was coming from the second floor, flickering like a flame. The closer I got, the more I felt a strange heaviness in the air, as if the house was watching me. I stood at the edge of the yard, my breath fogging in the frigid air, and stared up at the window. Suddenly, the light went out. I hurried back home, my heart pounding. I told myself it was nothing, an old house with leftover wiring or maybe squatters trying to keep warm. But the next night, the light returned, brighter this time. It flickered rapidly, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance across the snow. And then, the Christmas lights started appearing. At first, it was just one string of lights hanging loosely from the fence in my backyard. They weren't mine, I hadn't even finished decorating yet, but I assumed they were a prank from one of the neighborhood kids. I took them down and threw them away. The next morning, there were more. This time, they were wrapped around the tree in my front yard, blinking erratically in colors I didn't recognize. The lights were dull and faded, almost sickly, and they hummed softly, emitting a faint, unsettling buzz. I tried to ignore them, but the lights kept coming. They appeared in strange places, woven into the bushes, draped over my mailbox, and even coiled around my car. I removed them each time, but they always returned, multiplying like a virus. One night, I woke to find my entire living room bathed in their eerie glow. The lights had somehow crept inside, strung up around the windows, and wrapped around the furniture. I didn't know how they got in. That was when I started hearing the whisper. They were faint at first, just a soft murmur that I thought was the wind. But as the nights passed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably malicious. The lights began to pulse in time with the whispers, flashing brighter and faster until the entire house felt alive, breathing with an unnatural rhythm. Desperate for answers, I went back to my neighbor. She hesitated before speaking, glancing nervously toward the old house at the end of the street. "They say the house belonged to the Thompsons," she said quietly. "A family of 4. They loved Christmas, decorated more than anyone else on the block. But one year, there was a fire. No one made it out." She paused, lowering her voice even further. "Some people think their spirits stayed behind, that they're still trying to celebrate Christmas in their own way." That night, I decided to confront the house. I couldn't live like this anymore, surrounded by lights that felt like they were draining the life out of me. Armed with a flashlight, I marched to the old house. Ignoring the icy wind and the mounting sense of dread, the lights were glowing inside again, brighter than ever, casting the yard in a sickly green hue. The door was unlocked. Inside, the house was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of smoke and mildew. The walls were covered in strings of Christmas lights, their colors shifting and pulsating like a heartbeat. The whispers grew louder as I climbed the stairs, each step creaking beneath my weight. I followed the lights to a room at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. Inside, the walls were completely covered in lights, their glow so intense it hurt my eyes. In the center of the room stood a tree, decorated with ornaments that looked burned and charred. Beneath it were 4 presents, each wrapped in tattered paper and tied with black ribbon. The whispers stopped as I entered. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I reached for one of the presents. The paper crumbled at my touch, revealing an old photograph. It was a picture of me, standing in front of my house, surrounded by the Christmas lights. Before I could react, the lights surged, wrapping around my arms and legs, pulling me toward the tree. The whispers returned, louder and more frenzied, as the lights tightened, cutting into my skin. I screamed, but no one heard me. The next morning, the neighbors found my house completely dark. The lights were gone, the decorations removed, as if I had never lived there. At the end of the cul-de-sac, the old house stood silent once, its windows boarded up, its yard empty. But if you stand outside on a quiet winter night, you might see the faint glow of Christmas in the second floor window. And if you listen closely, you might hear the whispers. They're waiting for someone new to join them. Winter had always been magical to me. The way the snow blanketed the world in white, muffling every sound and making everything feel serene. That year, Christmas was no different. The snowstorm had been relentless, piling drifts so high that I could barely see the tops of my neighbors' fences. I was house sitting for my aunt while she visited family in another state. Her house was on the edge of a small town, with nothing but forest behind it. It was picturesque, isolated, and unnervingly quiet. The first night there, I decided to build a snowman in the front yard. It seemed like a harmless way to pass the time, and it gave the empty house a festive touch. The snowman was simple: 3 large snowballs stacked on top of each other, a carrot for a nose, and sticks for arms. I found an old scarf and hat in the closet and added them for character. As I stepped back to admire my work, I felt a strange sensation, like I was being watched. I turned around, scanning the empty street, but there was no one there. I chalked it up to the eerie stillness of the snowy night and went back inside. That night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, like the crunch of footsteps on snow, but it grew louder, more deliberate. I got out of bed and peeked through the curtains. The snowman was closer to the house. At first, I thought I was imagining things. The snowman looked exactly the same, but it was now standing at the edge of the yard, about 10 feet closer to the front porch. I laughed nervously, telling myself I must have been mistaken. Maybe I had built it there and forgotten. Still, I locked the door before going back to bed. The next morning, the snowman was back in its original spot. I stared at it from the front porch, trying to make sense of what I had seen the night before. Had I dreamed it? The snow around the yard was pristine, undisturbed. I brushed it off and went about my day, but the unease lingered. That night, the sound returned. Crunch, crunch, crunch. This time it was louder, more rhythmic, like someone or something was deliberately walking toward the house. I grabbed a flashlight and flung open the door, shining the beam into the yard. The snowman was standing at the bottom of the porch steps. Its head was tilted slightly as if it were looking at me. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it. The scarf and hat were gone, and its stick arms were now pointing upward, as if reaching for the house. I slammed the door and locked it, my heart racing. I tried to call someone, anyone, but the storm had knocked out the power and the cell service was spotty at best. I sat in the living room, staring out the window, unable to tear my eyes away from the snowman. Hours passed. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to the sound of something tapping against the window. Tap, tap, tap. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I might see. The snowman was there, pressed against the glass. Its once round face was now distorted, the snow packed unevenly to create a grotesque, misshapen grin. The carrot nose was gone, and in its place was a jagged piece of ice. I screamed and ran to the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife I could find. When I returned, the snowman was gone. The yard was empty, but the snow beneath the window was disturbed, as if something heavy had been standing there. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, I ventured outside to inspect the yard. The snowman was back in its original spot, looking as harmless as ever, but the ground around it was littered with footprints, large, uneven prints that didn't match any animal or human I'd ever seen. I decided then and there that I couldn't stay another night. I packed my bags and drove to the nearest motel, leaving the snowman and the house behind. My aunt called me a few days later, thanking me for house sitting. I didn't have the heart to tell her what had happened, so I just mumbled a quick, "You're welcome," and hung up. But as the weeks went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. And then, one night, I looked out my apartment window. Standing in the snow below was a snowman. It looked just like the one I had built at my aunt's house. Same jagged grin, same ice nose. I don't know how it found me, but it's closer now. Every night it moves a little closer. It was my first Christmas living on my own. I'd rented a small cabin on the outskirts of town, nestled deep in the woods. It was cheap, quiet, and perfect for someone trying to escape the chaos of the city. Or so I thought. The landlord had warned me about the old chimney. "It hasn't been used in years," he'd said. "Don't light a fire. It's not safe." I didn't think much of it. I wasn't planning on using the fireplace anyway. The cabin's heater worked fine, and I had no reason to mess with an old soot-filled chimney. But then, strange things started happening. It began with noises. At first, it sounded like scratching, soft and sporadic, as if a raccoon or bird had gotten stuck inside the chimney. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just part of living in the woods. But the noises grew louder, more deliberate. Late at night, I'd hear thuds coming from the chimney, followed by a faint, almost rhythmic scraping sound. It wasn't constant. Sometimes it would stop for hours, only to start up again just as I was falling asleep. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I crouched by the hearth and peered up into the chimney. The beam of light illuminated the blackened bricks and a thick layer of soot, but nothing else. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw it. A pair of glowing red eyes staring back at me. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. By the time I gathered the courage to look again, the eyes were gone. I told myself I was imagining, that it was just a trick of the light. But that night, the noises grew worse. The thudding became louder, shaking the walls of the cabin. The scratching turned into clawing, as if something was trying to tear its way out. And then I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, whispering words I couldn't understand. I barely slept that night. When morning finally came, I called the landlord. "There's something in the chimney," I told him. He was quiet for a moment before replying, "It's an old house, probably just animals. I'll send someone to check it out after the holidays." I didn't have the patience to wait. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I borrowed a ladder from a neighbor and climbed onto the roof, determined to figure out what was going on. The snow-covered shingles were slippery, and I almost lost my footing as I approached the chimney. But when I looked down into the flue, I froze. The soot had been smeared into strange, spiraling patterns, as if something had clawed its way up and down the walls. And at the very bottom, barely visible in the dim light, was a set of handprints. They weren't human. That night, I barricaded the fireplace, stuffing it with blankets and furniture, in a desperate attempt to keep whatever was inside from getting out. But the noises didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, and now they were coming from other parts of the house. The walls creaked and groaned, as if something massive was crawling inside them. Shadows danced across the room, flickering in the dim glow of the Christmas lights. And then the power went out. I was plunged into darkness, the only sound the relentless scratching and thudding from within the walls. Gripping a flashlight, I crept toward the front door, intending to leave the cabin and drive to the nearest motel. But when I opened the door, I stopped cold. The ground outside was covered in fresh snow, but there were no footprints leading to or from the house. Instead, there were claw marks, deep, parallel grooves that started at the edge of the porch and disappeared into the woods. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding. The noises were louder now, coming from every direction. And then, suddenly, everything went silent. I stood in the living room, flashlight trembling in my hand, waiting for something, anything, to happen. That's when I heard the whisper. It came from the fireplace, soft and sing-song, like a lullaby. Let me in. The barricade I'd built over the hearth began to shift. The blankets and furniture were pushed aside as something massive pressed against them from the other side. I backed away, my mind racing. The barricade collapsed, and the creature emerged. It was tall and gaunt, its body covered in soot and ash. Its limbs were impossibly long, ending in sharp, claw-like fingers. Its face was a twisted mockery of a human's, with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth that stretched unnaturally wide. It crawled out of the fireplace on all fours, its movements jerky and insect-like. I tried to run, but the creature was faster. It grabbed me with one clawed hand, its touch icy cold, and pulled me close. "You should have left," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. I don't remember much after that. I woke up outside in the snow, the sun rising over the horizon. The cabin was gone, reduced to a pile of rubble. The landlord told me later that the chimney had collapsed, causing the house to cave in. But I know the truth. I know what I saw. And sometimes, on cold winter nights, I still hear it. The scratching, the thudding, and the soft, sing-song whisper. Let me in. It was my first Christmas back home after years of living abroad. The family was thrilled to have me, and my younger sister Emily had been pestering me about gifts since November. She was only 10, still brimming with the kind of excitement about Christmas that I'd long outgrown. The evening was warm with laughter, holiday music, and the scent of pine from the oversized tree in the living room. Beneath its branches, piles of brightly wrapped presents awaited Christmas, but one gift stood out. It was small, wrapped in shiny red paper, with a gold ribbon, sitting slightly apart from the others. "Who's that one for?" Emily asked, her wide eyes gleaming with curiosity. No one knew. Dad assumed Mom had put it there, and she thought maybe it was from him. My grandparents and cousins all shrugged when asked. A mysterious gift, left by no one. I should have felt amused, maybe even charmed by the oddity. But something about the package made me uneasy. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up in the living room, reading. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Every so often, My eyes drifted to the red and gold package. It seemed closer. I laughed at myself, chalking it up to holiday jitters. But as the hours ticked by, the unease grew. Around midnight, I decided to take a closer look. I reached out and picked up the box. It was cold, unnaturally so, as if it had been left outside in the snow. The wrapping paper was pristine, almost too perfect, with no creases or tape marks. It weighed more than it should have for its size, and when I shook it lightly, a soft, rhythmic thud sounded from inside, like something shifting back and forth. A small tag dangled from the ribbon, blank except for two words written in jagged black ink. For you. Chills ran down my spine. I set the box down and retreated to my room, locking the door behind me. Whatever was inside that package, it wasn't meant for me or anyone else in this house. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the house. And then I heard it, a soft rustling sound, like wrapping paper being crumpled. I sat up, heart racing, straining to hear over the pounding in my ears. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, coming from the living room. Grabbing my phone, I crept to the door and opened it just a crack. The hallway was dark, but the faint glow of the Christmas tree lights spilled out from the living room. The rustling stopped. Then came the creak of floorboard, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was moving through the house. I stepped into the hallway, clutching my phone like a weapon, and tiptoed toward the living room. The gift was gone. The space beneath the tree where it had sat was empty, and the other presents remained undisturbed. Before I could process what was happening, I heard Emily's voice from upstairs. "Is that you?" she called, her voice groggy with sleep. I raced upstairs, finding her standing in the doorway of her bedroom, rubbing her eyes. "I heard something," she mumbled, pointing to the end of the hall. Following her gaze, I saw it. The red and gold package was sitting just outside her bedroom door. I grabbed Emily and pulled her into my room, locking the door behind her. "What's going on?" she whispered, clutching her stuffed bear. I didn't know how to explain it. "It's just a prank," I lied. "Probably from Dad. Stay here, okay?" Leaving her behind, I ventured back into the hall. The package was gone. Panic set in as I searched the house, finding no sign of the mysterious gift. But when I returned to my room, Emily was gone. The door was still locked from the inside, and the window hadn't been opened. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. On my bed, where she had been sitting moments before, was the red and gold package. This time the tag read, "Thank you!" I tore the box open in a frenzy, my hands trembling. Inside was a single object, Emily's stuffed bear, now dirty and torn, with a pair of blackened, claw-like handprints burned into its fabric. A guttural, inhuman laugh echoed through the house, followed by the sound of the front door slamming shut. The police found no trace of Emily. They said she must have wandered off during the night, but I knew better. The gift had taken her. I never saw her, but every Christmas since, I find the same red and gold package waiting for me, no matter where I go. I've stopped opening, but I know that one day it will come for me too. It was my first Christmas after moving to the small town of Willow Creek. The place was picturesque with snow-dusted rooftops, twinkling lights lining every street, and the smell of pine in the air. I'd always dreamed of a quiet, peaceful life, and it seemed like this town was the perfect place for that. But I never imagined that my holiday would be marred by something so unsettling, so dark. It was Christmas Eve, and I was preparing for a simple evening alone. I'd planned to watch holiday movies, drink hot chocolate, and enjoy the solitude of my new home. The house was modest but cozy, with a small fireplace and an old grandfather clock ticking away in the corner. I decorated it with a few ornaments and a tree in the corner, but it wasn't anything extravagant. The simplicity of it all was exactly what I wanted. As night fell, the storm outside intensified, howling against the windows. I settled on the couch, the fire crackling in front of me. Everything felt peaceful until the doorbell rang. I hesitated. Who could be out in this storm? It was nearly midnight and the snow was coming down thick. I wasn't expecting anyone, but there it was again. The doorbell, followed by soft knocking. I opened the door slowly, peering out through the crack. Standing on the porch was a man, tall, gaunt, with a thick black coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He was holding a small, plain package wrapped in brown paper. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. The man smiled, a strange, unsettling smile, his eyes dark and hollow, locked onto mine. "I've come for what's mine," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Before I could respond, he stepped closer, pushing the package into my hands. His touch was cold, his fingers unnaturally stiff. I wanted to pull away, but something about the way he looked at me, almost pleadingly, kept me from doing so. "I'm sorry, I don't understand," I started, but the man had already turned away. "Keep it," he muttered over his shoulder as he walked back into the storm, disappearing into the swirling snow. I stood there, confused, staring down at the package in my hands. The door was still open, the wind howling, but I felt a strange pressure building inside me. Something was wrong. I closed the door and took the package into the living room, placing it on the coffee table. The brown paper was simple, unmarked, and yet it felt heavy, as though there was more to it than just a gift. My curiosity got the best of me. I carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a small wooden box. It was old, worn, and had strange symbols carved into its surface. Symbols I didn't recognize. There was a sense of familiarity about it, as if I'd seen it before in a dream or a memory I couldn't quite place. My hands shook as I opened the box, revealing a small, cracked photograph tucked inside. It was a picture of a house. The house was familiar too. It looked almost identical to mine. Same shape, same placement, but the windows were dark, the house in a state of disrepair. The picture seemed old, yellowed with age, the edges curling, but the most unsettling part was the figure standing in front of the house. A man. The man from the porch. I dropped the photograph, my heart pounding in my chest. The fire crackled in the background, but it felt cold now. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread that I couldn't shake. Suddenly, the clock on the wall struck midnight. I heard a noise, a soft scraping sound coming from upstairs. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Slowly, I crept up the stairs, the sound growing louder with each step. At the top of the stairs, I stopped. The door to my bedroom was ajar. The scraping continued, now joined by a soft, slow thudding. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open. Inside, everything was as it should be, except for one. The bed was empty, the covers thrown back, but there, standing in the corner of the room, was the man. His face was even darker now, as if the shadows themselves had. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and he was staring directly at me, unmoving, waiting. The only sound was the soft thudding of my own heartbeat in my ear. "Leave," he whispered, his voice colder than the snow outside. "This house is." I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I backed away, my legs trembling until I hit the wall. The man took a step forward, and the air in the room grew icy. "Leave! Before it's too late!" Suddenly, the front door slammed open downstairs, and I heard the man's voice again, echoing through the house. "I'll come back for you, when you're ready." Then, everything went silent. I rushed downstairs, heart racing, but the house was empty. The door stood wide open, snow pouring in from outside. The storm had passed, leaving only the cold wind behind. I stepped outside, feeling the snow crunch beneath my feet. There was no trace of the man, no footprints in the fresh snow, only the package, sitting on the porch, untouched. I moved away from Willow Creek soon after. The house had been too much, too many strange occurrences, too much fear. But the man has never left me. Every Christmas, no matter where I go, I receive a small wooden box, always wrapped in brown paper. Each time, the house in the photo is more decayed, more ruined, and every year, the man is closer. It was my first Christmas after moving into the old house on the hill. The town, small and quiet, was beautiful in its own way. I'd heard stories from the locals about the house, whispers of its dark past, of strange occurrences that happened every year around Christmas time. But I was a skeptic. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, and I figured they were just trying to scare the new guy. That was until Christmas Eve. The house was perfect for me, a bit rundown but cozy in a way that felt like home. I'd spent the last few months settling in, unpacking boxes, and decorating for the holiday season. The tree was up, sparkling with lights, and I'd hung stockings by the fireplace. I even put up a few wreaths on the windows, despite not being a fan of excessive holiday decoration. The night was cold, the wind howling outside, but inside the house, it was warm and quiet. The fire crackled in the hearth, and I sat on the couch, sipping hot chocolate, feeling content. But around midnight, the calm was broken by a soft knock at the door. I was startled. Who would be visiting this late on Christmas Eve? I wasn't expecting anyone, and the town was so small that I didn't have any friends yet, let alone acquaintances who might pop by unannounced. I hesitated for a moment before going to the door. As I peered through the peephole, I saw no one, just the snow falling in thick, swirling patterns outside. I shook my head, chalking it up to the wind or my imagination, but then it came again, another knock, louder this time, almost insistent. Reluctantly, I opened the door. Standing in the doorway was a man, tall, dressed in an old-fashioned coat, with a scarf wrapped around his neck. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, and he stood there, staring at me with cold, empty eyes. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, unmoving. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked down at his feet, as if searching for something. Then, slowly, he looked up at me. "I'm here for the gift," he said softly, his voice low and hoarse. I didn't understand. "What gift?" I asked, my pulse quickening. I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. His eyes grew darker, almost black, as if the shadows inside them were consuming him. He stepped closer to me, his breath cold, and the one you took, almost as if he were speaking to. I stepped back, confused. I haven't taken any. I'm not sure what you mean. The man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old, tattered envelope. He held it out to me, but I didn't take it. Something in the way he looked at me, his eyes filled with an unnerving hunger, made me want to slam the door and run. Take it, he insisted, his voice now a low growl. You took it from me. It's time to return what's mine. I finally took the envelope from his outstretched hand, my fingers brushing against his icy skin. The coldness of it made my skin crawl. As soon as my fingers wrapped around the paper, the man stepped back, his expression still unreadable. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the falling snow. I stood in the doorway, heart pounding, unsure of what just happened. What gift? I hadn't taken anything, had I? I closed the door and returned to the living room, the envelope in my hand. My thoughts were a chaotic mess. Questions, fear, confusion. What was going on? What was this man talking about? I sat on the couch, staring at the envelope. It was sealed with a dark red wax, the imprint of a strange symbol pressed into it. I ran my fingers over the wax, feeling a chill run through me. Something about this felt wrong. I tore open the envelope and pulled out the letter inside. It was written in neat, flowing handwriting. You took what you should not have. Now, you must pay the price. My breath caught in my throat. I felt dizzy, like the room was spinning around me. What was he talking about? I hadn't taken anything. But then, a memory hit me like a tidal wave. A week before Christmas, I had found an old, dusty box in the attic while cleaning. It was tucked away in the corner, hidden behind old furniture and forgotten memento. Inside the box was a beautiful, intricately carved wooden ornament. A small angel, its wings outstretched, its face serene. It had been wrapped carefully in cloth, and I remembered thinking it was strange that someone would leave such a precious thing behind. It had caught my eye, so I took it downstairs, set it on the mantel by the fireplace, and forgot about it. I sat there staring at the letter, suddenly feeling sick. I had taken the ornament without thinking. I hadn't known it was anything special, just an old decoration. But now I realized I had unknowingly taken something that belonged to the man at the door, the same man who had just come to collect it. I rushed to the mantel and grabbed the ornament, my hands trembling as I held it up to the light. The carving was delicate, beautiful, but there was something wrong about it. The angel's face seemed to change when I looked at it. Its expression twisted into something sinister, its eyes dark and empty, just like the man's. I heard a creak behind me, and I spun around. The man was standing in the doorway again, his face shadowed, his eyes now fully black. He was smiling, a slow, twisted grin that sent a wave of ice through me. I told you it was time to return what's mine, he said, his voice now a rasping whisper. I didn't have time to react. The moment I looked at him, I felt myself losing control, like I was slipping into a dream, but not in the way dreams were supposed to be. The room spun faster, and the ornament burned cold in my hand. The shadows seemed to move, stretching toward me, and then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the man vanished into the darkness, leaving only the ornament behind. I don't know how long I stood there, trembling in the cold silence, but when I finally regained my senses, the man was gone. The ornament was still in my hand, but now it was just a piece of wood, plain and unremarkable. The town, the house, everything felt different. I had returned the gift, but something told me that the price was not yet paid. It was Christmas Eve, the night that's supposed to be full of joy, warmth, and festive cheer. But for me, it had turned into something darker, something I couldn't explain. This was my first Christmas alone in the house I'd just moved into, a large, old farmhouse that seemed to have its own presence. I didn't mind the solitude. I liked the quiet, the peacefulness, and the isolation from the world outside. But that night, everything changed. It had been a long day of decorating the house, hanging lights and wrapping presents. The smell of pine and cinnamon filled the air, and the glow of the Christmas tree lights made everything feel magical. I had planned to spend the evening reading and enjoying the comfort of my new home, but as night settled in, I began to feel an eerie stillness creeping over the house. The wind howled outside, making the windows rattle, but inside it was as if the house itself was holding its breath. I was curled up on the couch, a blanket wrapped around me, sipping hot cocoa, when I heard it, a soft knock on the door. I froze. It was nearly midnight, and I hadn't been expecting anyone. Who would come here at such a late hour, especially on Christmas Eve? I stood up, my heart beginning to race. I walked cautiously toward the door, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. Confused, I opened the door. The cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else, something faintly metallic like blood. The porch was empty, save for the dusting of snow that had accumulated. I stepped out onto the porch, looking around. Nothing. No car in the driveway, no footsteps in the snow. Just the empty, silent night. I was about to close the door when I noticed something on the ground near the steps, a small folded piece of paper. I bent down and picked it up. The paper was yellowed, old, and wrinkled, as if it had been there for years. I unfolded it slowly, revealing a message written in hurried, slanted handwriting. Leave before it's too late. He is coming. My blood ran cold. I glanced around again, but there was no sign of anyone, no movement in the shadows. I turned the paper over, but there was nothing on the back, just that cryptic message hanging in the cold night air. My first instinct was to dismiss it as a prank. The message was unsettling, yes, but I didn't believe in ghosts or any of that nonsense. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt something wasn't right. A heavy, suffocating thing pressed down on me, and the silence around the house seemed to thicken, as if the night itself was holding its breath. I went back inside and locked the door, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I tried to shake it off, but it wouldn't go away. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the otherwise silent house, marking the passage of time, and my thoughts grew more erratic. What did the message? Who left it? And why now? I decided to check the windows, just to make sure everything was secure. The wind had picked up, making the trees outside sway and creak. As I walked from window to window, I stopped at the last one, the one in the living room that faced the driveway. It was the only window that wasn't covered with curtains, and I could see the faint outline of the driveway and the dark stretch of road beyond. At first, I saw nothing, but then a shadow moved across the driveway, slow and deliberate. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, the shadow was still there, lingering at the edge of the driveway. It was too tall to be a tree branch swaying in the wind. It was a figure, someone standing in the dark, watching the house. My heart skipped a beat, and my stomach twisted with dread. I stepped back from the window, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and tried to call a friend, anyone who could help ease my growing fear. But the signal was weak. The call wouldn't go through. Then I heard it, a loud knock, followed by a deep, guttural voice calling my name. Sarah! Sarah! The voice was muffled, like it was coming from behind the walls. My blood ran cold. How did the person outside know my name? I backed away from the window, my eyes wide with terror. I couldn't understand what was happening. Was this a joke? Was someone playing tricks on me? I glanced around the room, looking for something, anything, to make me feel safe. The house felt colder now, the air thick with a heavy, oppressive energy. Then the knocking came again, this time from the front door. But it wasn't just a knock. It was a pounding, like someone was trying to break the door down. I ran to the door, heart racing, and looked through the peephole. No one. The porch was empty, the snow falling in soft, swirling patterns. I opened the door slowly, my breath coming in quick gasps. No one was there, but the cold hit me hard, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like the house itself was exhaling. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, obscured by the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, with a wide-brimmed hat that obscured its face. The figure moved slowly, as if it were dragging something behind it. The air grew colder still, and a foul, musty odor filled the air. I slammed the door shut, bolting it, but the feeling of dread was overwhelming. The house felt like it was closing in on me, as though the walls themselves were breathing. I could hear the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, on the porch, then the creaking of the door, as if someone was trying to turn the handle. I knew I had to leave. But the moment I stepped toward the back door, I heard the voice again, low and guttural, echoing through the house. Too late, it whispered. You should have left when you had the chance. The room grew darker, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. I backed away, feeling my heart race, my breath short. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath in the air. A knock came at the back door, followed by the voice again. I'm coming for you, Sarah. I didn't know how I got out of that house. One moment I was standing in the living room, paralyzed with fear, and the next, I was outside, running through the snow in my pajamas, not stopping until I reached the safety of a neighbor's house. I don't remember the exact details of how I escaped, but I've never gone back to that farmhouse. To this day, I don't know who or what was waiting for me that night. I never received an answer to the question that haunts me. How did it know my name? It was supposed to be a peaceful Christmas. My family and I had recently moved into an old house deep in the woods, far from the bustling city life. The house was beautiful in its own way, with creaking wooden floors and vintage furniture that spoke of a different time. The kind of place that had stories to tell if you listened carefully enough. At least that's what I thought. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first signs of something being off started on Christmas Eve. The house, though charming, was full of creaks and groans, as if the walls were alive. shifting with the weight of time. My wife Emily and I spent the day decorating the tree, setting up stockings, and preparing for the quiet holiday we had planned. Our two kids, Lily and Max, were excited about their presents, running around the house with an energy that only children on Christmas Eve could have. As night fell, we gathered around the fireplace to share stories and sip hot cocoa. The fire crackled warmly, and for a moment, everything seemed perfect. But then, the wind outside howled through the trees, and a strange sound drifted down the stairs from the attic, a soft, rhythmic tapping. "Did you hear that?" Emily asked, her eyes scanning the room. I didn't hear anything at first, but the sound came again, like someone gently tapping on the attic floor. The kids looked at each other, their faces pale, sensing the tension in the air. "I'll go check," I said, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I got up and made my way up the narrow staircase to the attic. The house was old, and the stairs creaked with every step, but the tapping continued. The attic door was closed, the faint sound coming from behind it. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what I would find, but curiosity got the best of me, and I slowly opened the door. Inside, the attic was dark, filled with old trunks, dusty furniture, and forgotten belongings. The air was cold, and I could feel the weight of history pressing in around me, but there was no one there. Nothing. Only the lingering sound of tapping, echoing in the silence. I looked around, trying to find the source. That's when I saw it. A small, old-fashioned music box sitting on a table in the far corner of the room. Its surface was covered in dust, but it looked oddly out of place. I walked over to it and noticed that the tapping sound seemed to come from the direction of the box. With a strange sense of dread, I reached out and touched it. The moment my fingers made contact, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. My heart raced as I slowly turned the key on the back of the music box. A soft, haunting melody began to play, its tune eerie and distorted, like it hadn't been played in years. The notes echoed through the attic, and the temperature seemed to drop even further. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a sense of unease flooded over me. I quickly closed the music box and left the attic, my pulse racing. I didn't know what it was about that box, but it felt wrong. It felt cursed. I tried to shake off the feeling, returning downstairs to my family, but something had changed. The house felt heavier, like the walls were closing in on me. Lily and Max were unusually quiet, sitting on the couch with wide, fearful eyes. Emily looked at me, concern in her gaze. "What happened?" "I don't know," I replied, trying to hide my growing sense of dread. "Just stay close, okay?" As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered, the temperature dropped in certain rooms, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. The tapping returned, faint at first, but growing louder, coming from the attic again. I didn't want to go back up there, but I knew I had to. Emily insisted on coming with me, and together, we made our way to the attic door once. When I opened it, the room was different. The furniture was no longer in its original places, and the trunks were overturned. The music box sat in the center of the room, its lid wide open. The eerie melody played again, louder this. But what really sent a shiver down my spine were the shapes, shadows, dark and indistinct, moving in the corners of the attic. I turned to Emily, my voice trembling. "We need to get out of here, now." But as I reached for her arm, the shadows began to take shape. Figures, faint, translucent figures, emerged from the corners of the room. They were not fully formed, but I could see their faces, pale and twisted with sorrow, their eyes hollow and empty. The air was thick with the smell of decay and rot. One of the figures reached toward us, its fingers stretched out like claws. I grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward the door, but something held us back. The door slammed shut in front of us, trapping us inside. The figures surrounded us, their whispering voices echoing in the room, repeating one thing over and over. "You shouldn't have come back." Panic set in. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but no one could hear us. The shadows moved closer, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. I didn't know how much time passed, but it felt like hours before the door finally burst open, and we stumbled out of the attic, gasping for air. We ran downstairs, the house now feeling like a maze, each corner darker and more oppressive than the last. The kids were gone, their rooms empty, their toys scattered across the floor. "Where are they?" Emily screamed, her voice full of terror. I didn't know, I couldn't explain it, but the house had taken them. I searched frantically, calling out their names, but there was no answer. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the basement. I didn't want to go down there, but something in me, something primal, told me I had no choice. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement door. The temperature had dropped again, and I could see my breath in the air. When I opened the door, the stairs led down into an abyss of darkness. I shone the light down, my hands shaking. At the bottom of the stairs, standing in the darkness, was Lily. Her eyes were wide, blank, as if she wasn't really there. "Lily!" I called, but she didn't respond. Behind her, in the deep shadows, I saw them, figures, the same twisted faces from the attic, slowly moving closer. I rushed down the stairs, but as I reached for Lily, she turned to face me. Her face was no longer her own. It was pale, lifeless, with hollow eyes staring back at me. The figures stepped forward, their whispers filling my mind. "You shouldn't have come back," they said, their voices overlapping. The basement door slammed shut behind me and everything went black. I don't know how long I was there, whether it was minutes, hours, or days. But when I woke up, I was alone. The house was empty. The kids were gone. And as I stepped outside, the snow falling softly around me, I heard the tapping once again, this time coming from the attic. I never should have come back to this house. It was supposed to be the perfect Christmas getaway, a cozy retreat in a remote cabin nestled deep in the mountains. My husband James and I had decided to escape the stress of our busy lives and enjoy a quiet holiday surrounded by snow, nature, and just each other. We rented a small cabin from an elderly couple who seemed friendly enough, but a little too eager to tell us about the history of the place. As we drove up the winding road, the landscape was breathtaking. Snow-covered trees lined both sides, and the distant mountains loomed like sentinels. We arrived at the cabin just as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the icy world outside. The elderly couple was there to greet us, their weathered faces smiling but a strange unease in their eyes. They handed us the keys and reminded us to be careful around the old mirror in the living room. The husband, Mr. Calloway, gave us an intense look, but I dismissed it as harmless superstition. The cabin was warm and inviting on the inside, with a stone fireplace, soft rugs on the wooden floor, and shelves lined with old books. Everything about it screamed, "Holiday retreat!" But the moment I stepped into the living room, my eyes were drawn to the large, antique mirror hanging on the far wall. It was ornately framed with dark wood, the edges carved with intricate patterns, and it had a hauntingly beautiful quality. But there was something off about it, a feeling I couldn't shake. That night, after a quiet dinner, we settled in front of the fire, sipping wine. The mirror caught my eye again, the flickering light from the fire reflecting off its surface, casting strange shadows across the room. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. Something about it felt like it was watching me. The next morning, I woke to find the mirror had shifted slightly, its position on the wall altered. It was subtle, but I was sure it hadn't been like that the night before. I mentioned it to James, but he just laughed it off. "Maybe the wind or the house settling," he said, distracted by the holiday music playing softly in the background. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was more than just a decorative piece. Something about it felt alive, as if it had its own consciousness. Later that day, I noticed something strange, a reflection that didn't match what was happening in the room. In the mirror, I could see the cabin's reflection, but it seemed distorted. The shadows in the glass were darker, more oppressive, and they shifted unnaturally. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that seemed to settle over me. I heard the wind howl outside, rattling the windows, and the house creaked in response. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house. I shot up in bed, my heart racing. It had come from the living room. "James," I whispered, shaking him awake. "Did you hear that?" He groggily sat up, but before he could respond, I heard it again. A soft scraping sound followed by a low murmur. I stood up, pulling on my robe and heading toward the living room. James followed, reluctantly rubbing his eyes. When we entered the room, the mirror seemed to shimmer. The reflection in it was distorted, blurred, like the surface of the water. It was as though something was moving just beneath the glass, trying to break free. And then I saw it. A figure, tall, shadowy, and indistinct, stood in the reflection, staring back at me with hollow eyes. My blood ran cold as I turned toward the empty room, but there was nothing. "James!" I gasped, my voice trembling. He stepped forward and looked into the mirror. His face paled as he backed away, stumbling over the rug. "There's something wrong with it," he said, his voice unsteady. We tried to leave the cabin the next day, but the snowstorm outside had gotten worse, and the road was impassable. We were stuck there, alone with the mirror. The eerie feeling only grew stronger as the hours passed. At night, the whispering began, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the mirror itself. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it, the scraping sound again, like something was scratching on the other side of the glass. I sat up, my heart pounding, and turned toward the mirror. The reflection had changed once again. This time, the figure was clearer, still dark and shadowy, but now it was closer, its features more defined. I could see its face, twisted in agony, and it smiled at me, jagged, yellowed teeth. I screamed and ran to the door, but it wouldn't open. James tried to help, but the door was stuck. as if something were holding it shut from the other side. The whispers grew louder, now clear as day. "Come closer," the voice called. "I'm waiting for you." I turned to the mirror in desperation, and there, standing behind the figure, was a dark, shadowy shape, something much larger, much older. It seemed to be reaching for. I could feel its presence, its cold, suffocating power. "Do you hear it?" I cried, my voice shaking. "Do you see it?" But James, his face pale, was staring at the mirror too. He reached out as if drawn to it, his hand trembling as it neared the surface of the glass. "James, no!" I shouted, but it was too late. The moment his hand touched the mirror, the air around us seemed to freeze. The shadows in the reflection twisted, their shapes contorting into something grotesque, and I saw a figure, tall and dark, reaching out toward him. The mirror rippled like water, and suddenly, James was gone. I screamed, banging on the glass, but there was nothing I could do. The room grew darker, the temperature dropping so low I could see my breath. The shadows in the mirror began to move, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for me. I ran for the door, my heart pounding in my chest, but it was still stuck. The whispers grew louder surrounding me, and I could hear James's voice faintly calling my name from the mirror. "Come to me," the voice whispered. "You belong here." I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed in fear, but I knew I couldn't stay. The house felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in as I stared at the mirror. Finally, with all the strength I could muster, I shoved the door open, breaking free of the suffocating pressure. I ran out into the snow, not looking back. The cabin loomed behind me, silent and ominous, and I never looked back. I never spoke about what happened to James, but I know the truth. He's still there, trapped in the mirror, waiting for someone else to come close enough. And every Christmas, I can feel the cold, chilling air from the mirror creeping toward me again. It was a week before Christmas, and my family was eagerly preparing for the holiday season. We had recently moved into a quaint old house in the small town of Willowbrook, hoping for a fresh start after the chaos of the past year. The house was charming in its own way, though it had a musty smell, and its creaky floors sometimes gave off a sense of unease. It was the kind of place you could imagine being filled with warmth and holiday cheer, especially at Christmas. However, as we would soon learn, it held secrets far darker than we could have ever imagined. The first sign that something wasn't right came on the day we unpacked the attic. My daughter, Sarah, had been excited to explore the old house. She was a curious 10-year-old, always eager to discover hidden corners and forgotten treasures. While going through a dusty old trunk, she found an antique doll, beautifully crafted and dressed in an old-fashioned red velvet dress with lace trim. Its porcelain face was flawless, its eyes glassy and unsettling, staring straight ahead, seemingly watching. Sarah immediately fell in love with the doll, and without hesitation, she decided it would be her new favorite Christmas decoration. I remember feeling a strange unease as she placed the doll on the mantel above the fireplace, but I brushed it off. It was just a doll, after all, and the excitement of the season quickly swept away my doubts. The night of December 23rd, we gathered around the tree to exchange stories, sip hot cocoa, and enjoy the festive atmosphere. The lights on the tree flickered gently, casting a soft glow across the room, and the fire crackled warmly in the hearth. But something felt off. At some point during the evening, Sarah excused herself to go to bed. As she left, I noticed that the doll on the mantel seemed to have moved slightly. Its head was tilted a little more to the side, as if it had been turned to watch us. I didn't say anything, not wanting to alarm my husband, Greg, but a creeping feeling started to settle in my stomach. That night, around 2 a.m., I was awoken by a soft noise, a faint tapping sound, like someone gently rapping on the wall. I groggily looked around, disoriented by the sound. My eyes drifted toward the mantel, and my breath caught in my throat. The doll's head was turned now, fully facing the room, its glassy eyes staring directly at me. The tapping continued, a rhythmic, almost deliberate sound coming from somewhere inside the house. I couldn't explain why, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The temperature in the room had dropped, and I shivered under the covers. Trying to brush off my fear, I forced myself to close my eyes and drift back to sleep. But as I did, the tapping grew louder, now coming from the direction of the hallway outside our bedroom. I wanted to call out to Greg, but my voice caught in my throat. The next morning, I found Sarah sitting on the living room couch, clutching the doll tightly in her arms. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The doll, it talked to me last night." My heart sank as I tried to make sense of her words. "What do you mean, sweet?" She hesitated, clutching the doll closer. "It told me to come closer. It said, 'Don't be afraid. I'm your friend.'" She paused, then added, "It moved, too. I saw it move." Greg and I exchanged a worried glance. I couldn't explain it, but something told me Sarah wasn't lying. There was something deeply wrong with that doll. That evening, we decided to confront the doll. We carefully moved it from the mantel and placed it on the table in the center of the room. The room felt colder. Despite the fire burning brightly in the hearth, we stared at the doll for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. There was no movement, no strange sounds. It sat still, just as it had when we first found it. But as I turned to walk away, a soft giggle echoed through the room, coming from nowhere. I froze, my blood running cold. Greg and I looked at each other, our faces pale. The sound was unmistakable, a child's giggle. And then it happened. The doll's head slowly turned to face us, its lifeless glass eyes fixating on us as though it were alive. Its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural smile, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I thought I saw its porcelain lips move. "I'm here to stay," it whispered. The following hours were a blur of confusion and fear. The doll seemed to move on its own. Sometimes its head would turn, other times it would be in a different spot entirely, as if it had walked across the room when we weren't looking. We tried to get rid of it, placing it in a box and sealing it in the attic. But each morning, it would reappear on the mantel, its expression twisted into that same smile. As Christmas Eve approached, the paranormal occurrences grew more intense. Strange whispers echoed through the house at night, the doll's eerie giggle filling the air. We could hear it even when we weren't in the same room, its voice soft but persistent. I began to see fleeting glimpses of something moving in the corners of my vision, shadowy figures, always too quick to identify. But they were there, always lurking, watching. By Christmas morning, we couldn't take it anymore. We had to leave the house, but the storm outside was too intense. Trapped in a house with no way out, we spent the day trying to hold ourselves together, but the doll's presence hung over us like a dark cloud. That night, just as we were about to sit down for dinner, the lights went out. The entire house was plunged into darkness. In the silence that followed, we heard it, the soft tapping, followed by the unmistakable sound of tiny feet moving across the floor. I turned on my flashlight, and there in the corner of the living room stood the doll. It wasn't on the mantel anymore. It was standing on its own 2 feet, staring at us with a malevolent grin. The room grew colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift. And then I heard the voice again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a sharp, piercing command. "Come to me." I grabbed Sarah and pulled her close, but as I turned, I saw something far worse than the doll. Behind it, just beyond the shadows, stood a figure, tall, pale, and gaunt, with eyes as dark as the night. The figure's mouth stretched into a grotesque smile as it reached out for us. We ran, desperately trying to escape the house, but the door slammed shut in front of us. No matter how hard we pushed, it wouldn't open. And then, the doll spoke once more. "You're mine now." The figure moved closer, its form dissolving into the darkness, and we could hear its laughter, low, guttural, and terrifying. It was then I realized that the doll wasn't just an object. It was a vessel, a link to something much darker. The next morning, the snowstorm had stopped, and we finally managed to break free of the house. We never spoke about what happened that Christmas. The town of Willowbrook tried to forget, and the old house was eventually abandoned, left to the elements. But every Christmas, I hear that faint, childlike giggle in the distance, and when I look into the shadows, I swear I see the pale figure waiting for the next family to find the doll.